Hello and welcome to our lecture material on emerging adulthood. And I'm so excited we're here because for most college students, if you're a traditionally aged college student, this is your developmental stage. So emerging adulthood is also our newest developmental stage, and that even made the news in the last decade. As you remember, Jeffrey Jensen Arnett, the author of our textbook, is one of the world's leading experts on emerging adulthood and is even given credit for kind of coining that phrase. And so emerging adulthood is to help us kind of bridge the gap between adolescence and young adulthood. If you have a chance, go into YouTube and search for hashtag #ThisIs18 from the New York Times, and you'll see just a very short 2-minute video about what 18 looks like for girls around the world, which was a project that the New York Times did recently. And just some of the privileges of turning 18 around the world. In the US, you can do things like vote or sign a lease on an apartment, obtain a credit card, buy a jewel, or cigarettes. In China and parts of Canada, it gets you entrance to a pub. In Israel, it means that you've been drafted into the military. And by 18, about 1 in 5 women around the world will be married, and millions will enter college or university. In addition to drawing on our textbook for this lecture, I'm also pulling on this book called Getting to 30, which is by our textbook author, Jeffrey Jensen Arnett and Elizabeth Fischel, and it's written for parents of emerging adults. And so this would be a fun Mother's Day, Father's Day, holiday present for your parents. And it's, again, this idea that many of the things that people used to be doing in their early 20s to indicate that they were a quote-unquote real adult are now happening closer to 30. And so, this idea of 30 is the new 20. So let's look at why we now have this stage of emerging adulthood, which maybe didn't make sense 50 years ago. Or I guess that's now 60 years ago. So in 1960, the average age of marriage for women was 20 and for men was 22. Now it's closer to 27 for women and 29 for men. In the 1960s, the average age of the birth of your first child was early 20s. Now it's late 20s or early 30s. In 1960, only about 33% of people in the US attended college, and most were men. And now 70% attend, and most are women. For jobs, you could expect maybe stable work in your early 20s, and in fact, you might continue to work at the same workplace for many, many years. Now, people in their 20s change jobs an average of 7 times between 20 and 29. Okay, so why have we seen such shifts in people's experiences in their 20s? And so a big factor, obviously, is that people are delaying marriage and child rearing or childbearing. And they're doing that because first, the advent of the birth control pill at the end of the 1960s gave women more control about having babies, and so gave them more choices or freedom, along with the legalization of abortion. The sexual revolution also allowed for kind of less stigmatized premarital sex. Obviously, still controversial for some people, but made premarital sex more accepted. And so obviously it would be challenging to wait until you're 30 to get married and have sex. But if you can have sex before that, then maybe you can wait a little bit longer to get married. Increased education for everyone, and particularly for women. And now we have more people extending their education, going on to graduate school. More different opportunities for women. So women in the 1960s could be secretaries, nurses, flight attendants, or teachers. And now women are in all areas of the workforce. And then lastly, cohabitation has become an increasingly common path for many emerging and adults in general. And so this delays marriage. So what does emerging adulthood look like in other countries? So Europe has always had a longer period of emerging adulthood. They were kind of ahead of us. So even when I was in Italy, close to 30 years ago now, people were living with their parents until they got married, and often that was in their late 20s. And so age of marriage and parenthood has been around 30 in a lot of Europe. In Asia, in order to be seen as an adult, you not only have to be financially independent for yourself, but you also, which we would also consider a piece of adulthood in the United States, but you also need to be able to support your parents financially. So there's that kind of collectivist ideal coming in. And in developing countries, whether or not there is a stage of emerging adulthood depends on whether or not it's more of a rural or more of an urban environment. So in urban developing countries, young people are more likely to experience emerging adulthood, or might be going to the university, not, delaying marriage, delaying having kids. But in more rural areas, many adolescents and people in their early 20s are already getting married or having kids. So here's some common myths about emerging adults that are currently happening in the United States, and you may reflect on which one of these you hear the most. So one myth is that young people are lazy, but the reality is they're often working at low-paying jobs or struggling to find a good job and combining school and work. Another myth is that young people are selfish, and as we're going to see, yes, young emerging adults are self-focused. It's one of the tasks of emerging adulthood. One of your developmental tasks is to be self-focused. Yet, we also know that emerging adults express more tolerance for diversity and also do a lot of community service. A myth, they're getting worse, right? And that's that whole kids these days. And so the family historian Stephen Mintz once said that, remember, the older generation always thinks that the younger generation is going to hell in a handbasket. That has been consistent throughout history. And so it's common for older people to think that somehow they were a lot better when they were your age, right? And so in reality, a lot of things have gotten better. Alcohol abuse, crime, teen pregnancy, and deaths in car accidents have all declined since the good old days. So Arnett and Jensen have identified some of the key features of emerging adulthood, and you might reflect on which one of these feels the strongest for you right now. So first, emerging adulthood is the age of identity explorations, and so you are in emerging adulthood being able to figure out possibilities for work, romantic partners, religious identity, political identity. It's also an age of instability, so that there can be lots of moving around between the ages of 20 and 30. Like many of you, I lived in like 8 or 9 different apartments or houses, and we'll see an upcoming slide kind of showing some evidence of that. It's the age of self-focus, and so part of that is figuring out identity and also developing self-sufficiency. One example of self-focus is when I would get asked out in my early 20s and I didn't want to go out with that person, I would say something like, "Oh, I'm just working on myself right now." And that made sense to everybody, right? So in case you want to use my line, you can. It's the age of feeling in between, being an adolescence and an adulthood. It's also the age of possibilities. So typically during emerging adulthood, people are less likely to be tied to a specific partner or to have kids or have committed to a career path. And so it's the potential for all kinds of experience and change. There's more options and more freedom. So this just shows us residential change, and you can see that it peaks at 25 and then begins to decline towards more stable, kind of less moving around as we age. So here's getting at that age of in between. Do you feel like you have reached adulthood? Green being yes, blue being no, and yellow being yes and no. And you can see that the yellow bar is the highest between the ages of 18 and 25 and then begins to decline. Okay, so that finishes our introduction to emerging adulthood as a developmental stage, and let's get more into physical development. Emerging adulthood is a time of peak physical functioning. So your VO2 max, how much oxygen your body can transport to your organs, and your cardiac output, your blood flow from your heart, both peak in your early 20s. Reaction time, grip strength, bone density are all at its peak. You are in emerging adulthood the least susceptible to physical illnesses. You have the least amount of injury, yet there are quite a few lifestyle challenges. It's a time where you might not be eating as well. You might be experiencing high stress and especially not doing so well on sleep. And so there's something called sleep debt or delayed sleep phase syndrome, which is you're staying up late during the week, on weekdays, getting up early for school or work, and then accumulating this sleep debt that you kind of sleep off in delayed sleep phase syndrome on the weekend. And college students are more likely to show delayed sleep phase syndrome, and about 2/3 of college students report sleep problems and 1/3 report pretty severe sleep disturbances. And we're going to be coming back to sleep when we talk about mental health. Exercise also, and I should also mention eveningness there, which we talked about in adolescence. That's the desire to stay awake in the evening. On average, that peaks around the age of 20 to 21 and then begins declining. Exercise, despite your kind of potential for peak performance, declines from adolescence. And when we talk about this in class, students say it's because maybe they have less time, more responsibility, but also because they're not in high school, less likely to be in organized high school sports. Maybe they have independence and their parents aren't kind of making them do it. So about half of college students get the recommended amount, which is 5 times a week of moderate exercise or 3 times a week of high intensity. So in terms of the benefits of exercise, we'll be talking about this a lot through the rest of the course. But exercise has been shown to, for example, reduce anxiety in mice specifically. So this was a study where some mice were able to exercise and some weren't. So you don't actually have to tell mice to exercise. You can just put a wheel in their cage, and if they've got it, they're going to be runners. And so those mice who were runners showed basically an increase in the activation of inhibitory neurons in their hippocampus. And so when they were put through a stress test, which was for these mice, making them swim briefly in cold water, they released more of GABA, this sedating amino acid, that allowed them to experience kind of more a quick calm response following the stress test compared to the mice that hadn't been running. And then another research study found that exercise improves memory function in emerging adults. And so this is just even a 10-minute kind of light intensity exercise activity can immediately alter parts of the brain and improve memory function. And so they studied healthy college students, and they had them kind of do short, kind of brief exercise activities, whether that's walking or just slow biking. And they then put them through memory tests before and after they had exercised, and they found that students were better on these memory tests after they had ridden the bike. And MRI scans showed that portions of their brain in the hippocampus were more synchronized with the rest of the brain. So there's a lot of things we worry about that we don't need to worry about, but one of the things that we should worry about for everybody, but particularly for emerging adults, is car accidents, because it is the leading cause of death for emerging adults. And that's due to, on average, more risky driving behavior, so higher speeds, maybe driving under the influence, driving late at night, texting while driving, driving through the night, driving with friends. And research suggests that, as we talked about in adolescence, that we're more likely to do risky things in the presence of our peers. And I can think back to my 20s and think of kind of crazy things that I shouldn't have been doing, like riding in the back of a pickup truck at high speeds in Florida. Yet, at the same time, the vast majority of college students do report regularly wearing seatbelts, which is a huge change from, what it might have been 40 years ago. So substance use and abuse can have a peak during the early 20s, and researchers think that's because there's more unstructured socializing time in the evenings, because you want to stay up later, right? There's more time to do things. There's less parental supervision. There's less obligations that are maybe making you get up early the next morning. And so there's more kind of time to just hang out, and substance use, which can turn into abuse, can become a part of that. So this graph is from 2014, so things are probably changing, and this is also in the United States, not Colorado specifically. But what you can see is that binge drinking, so not just alcohol use, but binge drinking peaks in the early 20s and then declines, and marijuana use follows a similar pattern. Research on cannabis use is obviously changing a lot these days, but what you can see from this data from the United States, not Colorado specifically, is that we see some of the highest use among emerging adults. So in different parts of this PowerPoint, I'm going to pull on data from the American College Health Association assessment from 2017. And so what you can see here is that when we surveyed college students about their actual and perceived substance use, they perceived that other of their peers, in terms of college students, were more likely to be using alcohol and marijuana than they actually are. And out of the 65,000 college students who were surveyed, those who reported drinking within the past 12 months also did report some instances of regret. Obviously not most. This was a smaller percentage, but on average, you can see the list of regrets, but on an average, about a third of males and females reported doing something that they later regretted while they were drinking. Okay, so let's shift gears from physical development on to cognitive development. So after we get out of adolescence, we think of cognitive development in the form of post-formal thinking, because Piaget was formal operations, so now we're post-formal. And a couple of features are both pragmatism and dialectical thought. And pragmatism is simply just thinking more realistically and practically. So sometimes maybe the logical choice would be one thing, but you know that that's not actually going to be very practical or realistic. And then dialectical thought is moving beyond what's often called black and white thinking, where we see things as right versus wrong or either or. And so in emerging adulthood, there's a growing awareness that problems often don't have a clear solution, and two opposing strategies or points of view might both be right. And emerging adults gain more tolerance for complexity. And so they might be more likely to understand that you could believe two things that contradict each other, or that you could change your mind, right? It can also be about things like choosing, or in politics. So the CSU Center for Public Deliberation tries to break through political polarization by always coming up with a third point of view. It's not just either or, but it could be a third view as well. And it's realizing that many questions don't have a clear answer. It's not, does cohabitation increase the likelihood of divorce? It's not yes or no, but it depends. Do affairs devastate a marriage? It's not yes or no, but it depends. And dialectical thought makes me think of Darth Vader, actually, because he was supposed to be evil and bad, but Luke says there's good in him, I can feel it, and Darth Vader redeems himself, at the end of the Return of the Jedi. And so people are complex, and they're rarely all bad or all good, and that would be the dialectical model. Some other examples of dialectical thinking are drawn from more Eastern or Asian cultures. So the Chinese symbol for crisis is both the symbol for danger and opportunity. So it's a dangerous opportunity, both kind of the negative and the positive. Or the yin-yang symbol is used to describe how polar opposites or seemingly contrary forces are interconnected or independent. So light and dark, or love and hate, always coexist. And there's a Chinese parable that actually gets at this idea that things can depend, or bad and good can be combined. So I'll tell you this quick story. There's a Chinese story of a farmer who used an old horse to till his fields. One day the horse escaped into the hills, and when the farmer's neighbors sympathized with the old man over his bad luck, the farmer replied, "Bad luck? Good luck? Who knows?" A week later, the horse returned with a herd of horses from the hills, and this time the neighbors congratulated the farmer on his good luck. His reply was, "Good luck? Bad luck? Who knows?" Then, when the farmer's son was attempting to tame one of the wild horses, he fell off its back and broke his leg, and the neighbors thought this was very bad luck. Not the farmer, whose only reaction was, "Bad luck? Good luck? Who knows?" Some weeks later, the army marched into the village and conscripted every able-bodied youth they found there. When they saw the farmer's son with his broken leg, they let him off the hook. Now, was that good luck or bad luck? Who knows? It depends. And so Chinese college students, for example, when compared with American college students, are more likely to think that a romantic couple will break up, or two childhood adversaries will become kind of romantically engaged in adulthood. So more likely to realize that things that appear to be opposing can interconnect or shift. So another example of both pragmatism and dialectical thinking is this idea that a lot of decisions don't have a right or a wrong. And this model is drawn from a very old book called Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway, which I would still recommend in emerging adulthood for all the decisions that you have to make. And it's this idea that we often think, when we're trying to make a decision, for example, about where to do our internship, or what major to have, that one of those is going to be the right decision and one of those is going to be the wrong decision. But instead, both of those decisions are going to give us important information. And so I often say to students, let's say you do your internship with little kids and you decide that you didn't like working with little kids. Does that mean you made a mistake in choosing little kids for your internship? No, that gave you important information, right? Now you know for the rest of your life, when you're thinking about kind of career options, that little kids are not for you. And so there can be gains in any types of decisions that we make, or most of them, let's say. So this quote just reminds us that maybe in our teens and 20s, we're trying to kind of solve problems and get the answers to questions. And then over time, we start to realize that we may not have the answer to the question, and we get more at peace with not knowing. Okay, so elementary school is often referred to as primary education, middle and high school called secondary education, and college or university is called post-secondary or tertiary education. And so we're seeing huge increases around the world, obviously mostly in developed countries, but also in developing countries. And this is becoming we're seeing even more dramatic growth for women than we are for men. We know that countries vary in this process of having to identify your area of specialization or major. There are some countries in Europe where you have to identify that in high school, and other places where it's even later, perhaps, than in the United States. In the United States, because we do not have kind of federal level funding for university education, tuition rates are quite a bit higher and have risen a lot faster than standard inflation in the United States. And in the US, most Americans will take 6 years to earn a 4-year degree, and the major reason for that is financial. However, getting a college degree still seems to be worth it on average. It's higher pay over the course of your lifetime, and better kind of performance on verbal, quantitative, or critical thinking kinds of tests. There's no evidence yet that getting a degree from a private school is better than getting a degree from a public university in terms of financial or cognitive benefits. It's just getting a college degree. So this graph just shows us of university or college attendance rates around the world, with darker colors indicating a higher percentage of the emerging adult population is attending college or university. Okay, so let's talk about gender and academic achievement. And so what current research is saying is that females are generally outperforming males in grades and academic success in most countries, and we've got a higher percentage of women at universities compared to men. And the only gender differences that have shown up are not around, for example, intelligence, but are more around factors related to effort, engagement, or motivation. So this could be, due to differences in some executive functions, but it can also be that men who do not have college degrees don't face the same penalties that women do. So men, for example, who drop out of college face no initial financial penalty, while women are penalized right away. Men who don't have a college degree can earn more on average than women who don't have a college degree, because typically male professions that don't require college degrees, like maybe being a mechanic, pay a lot more than maybe the care work that women might be doing without a college degree. However, even with all of their success academically, female graduates earn about 82% of what male graduates earn. So this was an older model of college subcultures developed in the 1960s by Clark and Trowell, but perhaps still applies in US college experiences, and that people might be having different kind of attitudes or goals when they're at college. And obviously you don't have to fit in just one category, you could identify with several of them. So if you are kind of in the more collegiate category, then you're thinking about college as primarily being more social or more fun, with academics being secondary. If you're vocational, then you're often thinking about getting a college degree to get more money, and you're not really engaging in kind of ideas just for the sake of ideas. You're doing it with a clear end goal in mind. Academic is what often administrators think what you're here for is intellectual development. And then rebel is more non-conforming, is that you might study for things that you really do like, but disengage for things that you don't seem that are important, and be more skeptical. So this is again pulling on data from the American College Health Association survey of about 65,000 college students in 2017, and kind of what are the sources of academic disruption. And you can see that general stress is about a third, or about 30% would say that has disrupted their academics in the past year. Anxiety, sleep difficulties, depression, and then smaller amounts saying internet use, extracurriculars, worrying about family or friends, or having some relationship difficulties. So work obviously really varies in emerging adulthoods, but on average, emerging adults are working in lower paying jobs, are spending more time exploring careers, as we talked about, are changing jobs a lot, and maybe experiencing unemployment. So unemployment rates for ages 18 to 25 are twice as high as those from 25 and up. And this can vary depending upon whether or not we're talking about someone with a college degree or without a college degree. So the meaning of work, this research really applies throughout adulthood, but I put it here in emerging adulthood, and this is based on some research by Amy Wierzniewski, if I'm saying her name correctly, which basically says that people have different attitudes or thoughts about their work. And of course, these could change over time, or you could meet more than one category. But in general, there might be these three orientations to work: a job orientation, a career orientation, and a calling orientation. And she found that about a third of workers fit in each category. And so the first one is job orientation. It's this idea that it doesn't matter so much what I'm doing, but that I'm earning money to support my family or to make a better life for myself or for my kids. And it's less about the actual task that I'm doing. Although I might grow to love it, right? Career orientation is this idea that we're going to choose jobs that give us maybe prestige or give us a good life, less kind of about soul searching for the perfect fit for us. And so I often think of my husband in this example. His parents struggled with money when he was in adolescence, and so he looked to his uncle, who was an engineer, and said, that's what I'm going to be, and so it was less kind of a searching about, is that my dream job, right, or what I want to do, and more about something that was going to give kind of a good life, upward mobility, and engineering was a more prestigious option. And then the last one is that kind of calling orientation. So this idea that you're kind of searching for your dream job to have kind of personal fulfillment and identity. And, there are people who have really criticized this idea for good reason, is that oftentimes going with this can create challenges and you never quite know where you're going to end up. And so following your passion isn't always the best advice. The important thing to know is that job crafting, this idea of making the job fit your strengths or skills, can happen in any category. So once you get into a job, you can find things that you really like about it and try to dial those up, and maybe delegate to somebody else the things that you don't like. Okay, so let's turn our attention to emotional and social development.
Gen Z, or the generation that are college students now, are unique in that they are the most educated generation in history. And so we already saw that we have a lot more people attending college than ever before. And they're also the most racially and ethnically and likely gender identity, sexual orientation, diverse generation than we've ever had before.
Okay, so now let's talk about the boomeranging back home. So about 40% of all emerging adults will return home at least once. And so at any given point in time, that's 20% of emerging adults who are back at home. And as we've talked about that, this has already been happening. Staying at home has been happening quite a bit in European countries because maybe a higher value of placed on the support of family, or just the higher standard of living you can experience by staying at home. It's been less stigmatized. But now we're seeing that happening in the US too, because of rising student loan debt, higher rates of tuition, lower kind of entry-level job pay, high rates of unemployment between the ages of 18 and 25, like we talked about, higher cost of living, and perhaps helicopter parents, which we'll talk about. And in general, basically emerging adults say that this is going pretty well, living at home. Close to 80% are satisfied with living arrangements. About half are paying for rent. Almost all are helping with household expenses. About 40% say it's actually been good for their relationship with their parents, and only about 12% actually say it's been bad. So helicopter parenting has been discussed internationally in countries ranging from England to China, and universities are now providing guidelines sometimes for staff in interacting with parents. And what you should know is that overall, the research is mixed but kind of positive, basically, and it's important to kind of distinguish between parental support and overparenting. And generally, support is a good thing. Emerging adult children who had parental support in terms of financial support, emotional support, or advice numerous times a week reported higher well-being and higher life satisfaction. But if students perceive their parents to be overparenting, then that is correlated with kind of a reduced sense of self-efficacy, which is meaning like your belief that you have the knowledge and the skills to succeed on your own in social situations or in academic situations. So what I always say is, in general, if parental support is working for you, then there's nothing to be embarrassed about, and it's a good thing. But if it feels like it's overparenting and it's got the emerging adult is perceiving it to be negative, then there's probably changes that might need to be made. Self-esteem generally increases from adolescence into emerging adulthood, and so we might wonder why this is. Some common things that we have discussed in class are that your awkwardness around physical appearance declines. Peers have kind of less of a can have less of a negative influence on you. Family relationships tend to improve. You tend to have more control and autonomy in your life. So Marcia's identity statuses is an old and famous kind of identity construct, and it's based on Erikson's identity versus identity confusion. And again, we know that identity development is happening during adolescence, but it's certainly continuing on into emerging adulthood as well. And so the key areas to form identity are in love, work, and ideology, like political or religious. And so during emerging adulthood, people are working in these areas to form identity, and occupation is probably one of the biggest ones. And so Marcia classified adolescents actually into one of 4 identity statuses based on their degree of exploration and their degree of commitment. And so the one that looks kind of like the ideal that we're perhaps all going for is achievement. We've explored different identities, whether it's related to career or politics or religion or romance, and then we've decided on one or committed to it. But we also know that people might be in other categories for various reasons. So sometimes they're in foreclosure. They're very committed to an identity but didn't explore much. So perhaps they always knew they were going to take over the family business, and so there wasn't, and they were fine with that, and so there wasn't a lot of point in exploring career paths. Or maybe when we're younger, for example, we have had less time to explore and less commitment, so we're more in diffusion. And then moratorium, I think, is an important one to highlight. This is where you are exploring but you haven't committed. And it's challenging to be in moratorium because it is more of that limbo, but it's an important place to be. And in fact, my very first day of graduate school, one of our faculty members said, "Don't be afraid to stay in moratorium." In terms of ethnic identity, if you are of the majority of culture, in whatever country you live in, then this is often, ethnic identity seems kind of invisible, or it might feel really simple or straightforward. But if you're more minority culture in terms of ethnicity, then identity can be more complex. And although people who have assimilated their ethnic identity into their predominant culture, like I'm not this, I'm just American, can be successful, we also see quite a bit of research that says that having a bicultural identity is favorable. So you can identify as both the majority culture and the minority culture in different ways. Okay, so a few slides here about religious development. And so what research has indicated is that for current emerging adults, religious beliefs tend to be stronger than actual behavior, like attendance at a religious institution. Believing in God might be more important than actual believing in specific religious doctrine. Emerging adults are more tolerant of religious differences, especially as they meet other people from different religious backgrounds and cultures. And then in general, religious beliefs are correlated with higher well-being and lower risk behaviors. So this was a few years back, and this was done on millennials, so not Generation Z. And what the Pew Research found was that millennials were less likely to engage in a lot of religious behaviors and specific beliefs compared to people who were older than them. But this depends upon your specific cultural group. So African Americans, for example, would show higher rates of religious belief and behaviors. So even though on average we might see religious kind of focus or beliefs or practices declining during emerging adulthood, we also do see that emerging adults report kind of wrestling with the big questions. Do I believe in God? What do I believe about an afterlife? How am I similar or different from my parents and how I was raised? And do I want to identify as religious, spiritual, or neither? Okay, so emerging adults tend to be engaged in activism, but overall have lower political participation in terms of voting, and you can see those graphs there. So more likely to, for example, be involved in protests or the Peace Corps or activism for environment or activism against racism, but compared to older adults, not as likely to turn out in terms of. So even though college students are less likely to vote, you can see that between 2014 and 2018, the greatest gains in voter turnout were among college students. So it looks like maybe beginning to kind of close that gap in terms of voting. All right, so switching gears to talk about romantic partners, people often ask, are we more likely to, is it opposites attract or, birds of a feather flock together? And what the research would say historically is that it's been more birds of a feather flock together, more what's called homogamy, where like attracts like. And so in terms of romantic partners, people are more likely to be similar than different in terms of social class or socioeconomic status, in terms of ethnicity, religious beliefs, even levels of intelligence or IQ, physical attractiveness. And this is why sometimes when we see two people who seem very different in terms of physical attractiveness, we think like, why is he with her? Or something like that. Personality traits, so introverts more likely to pair with introverts, extroverts with extroverts, for example, and attachment security, meaning that people who have more attachment security are likely to pair with people who have more, and people who have less are likely to pair with people who have less. However, of course, there's so many different ways that we can be similar or different with someone we're in a romantic relationship with, so we're always going to notice the ways that we are similar, but then we're going to also notice the ways that we are kind of different and complement each other. Okay, so in the spirit of exploring identity around romantic partners, I'm going to introduce this activity for exploring kind of who you've been attracted to over time and who you're looking for. And so I got this from an old book by Harville Hendrix called Getting the Love You Want. And it's an activity that I used to do even with clients in therapy. And so the idea is that for each column, you list someone in chronological order who you've either been in a relationship with or had a serious crush on. Some of us didn't have too many relationships, but we had a lot of serious crushes, and other people had more relationships. And so then you put their name at the top, and then you list their characteristics in the column below. And then you'd go on to the next person kind of chronologically in your life and do the same. And then you kind of use that to start to look for what have been the patterns in who you've been attracted to, and then you think about how well that's worked out for you and whether or not that's a trait that you want to continue to look for in your ideal partner. And so doing this can kind of help you think about who you're looking for in an ideal partner. And so these are my crushes and partners from when I was younger. And so my first crush, his name was Heath, and I had a crush on him for like 12 years. And you can see his traits there. He was definitely one of those cool, charismatic, kind of jerky guys, obviously really cute, a casual dresser, why I still think men in flip-flops look really cute, great musical talent. And then I went on to have my first boyfriend, and he had a lot of traits in common with Heath, kind of that cool, charismatic guy, aloof, was more preppy, athletic, and of course, cute. Then I had a third short-term relationship, and this guy was similar, except I got a little bit away from the kind of cool dude and got more into a kind, somewhat unique person. He had a brother with that had special needs, and he was a caretaker for him, and so that made him a little bit of a different kind of guy, but he was still pretty masculine and preppy, and of course cute. And then I had this really pivotal crush when I was at summer camp. Unfortunately, it took me a month to realize that my crush actually had a girlfriend at camp, because how would I know? He was hugging all the girls. Anyway, he was also really charismatic, but also kind of had that thread of kindness. And then he began to challenge my sense of masculinity and what I was attracted to. He was more kind of gender neutral in how he appeared. At least for the 1990s, you know, and he was more unique, and he was still, of course, athletic and cute. And so then that helped me kind of form what I was looking for in a romantic partner and kind of get clear. And I remember making a list, you know, very similar to this in the couple of months before I met my husband. So I'm hoping that you'll do the same, make your lists, and then reflect on what are your themes, what are the traits you want to keep, and what do you want to change. Okay, cohabitation is something we've seen a dramatic change in the last couple of decades. So cohabitation used to be something that was fairly uncommon and stigmatized, and now it's very common and less stigmatized, although still controversial for some people. But we're at the point now that the majority of relationships are beginning as cohabiting relationships, or have cohabitation before marriage. And the amount of divorce risk is really related to commitment, although again, it's weakening because cohabitation rates have continued to rise and divorce has flattened out. But generally, the more committed you are at the time of cohabitation, the less risk for divorce later. But if you are kind of cohabitating out of convenience, kind of what's that kind of sliding into cohabitation and then you slide into marriage, then that can put you more at risk for divorce later, especially if you're doing that kind of repeatedly, kind of serial convenience cohabiting, which is normal to do, but is in the research data a little bit more correlated for risk of divorce. Okay, so let's talk about sexual intimacy in emerging adulthood. So it's a varying time. The most common pattern is to have had one sexual partner in the past year, but some people have had none and others have had multiple. In terms of abstaining from sex or not having sex, there's a difference between being an active abstainer or an accidental abstainer. So active abstainer is purposefully not having sex, like I don't believe in sex before marriage, or I want to be in love before I have sex. An accidental abstainer is more like, yeah, I would have had sex, but I just didn't have the opportunity. Premarital sex is the highest in Western countries like the US and also African countries, and it's the lowest in Asian and Arab countries. And in the United States, this is a time with higher rates of hooking up or casual sex. And because that's often co-occurring with substance use, that is a risk factor for contracting a sexually transmitted infection. So this was a research study in 2015 with about 1,500 college students who were asked about a hookup in the last year. So it wasn't just immediately following a hookup. And what they found is that about 60% of the people that they surveyed felt mostly positive about their hookup. And you can see they reported things like being happy, feeling desirable, feeling adventuresome. And then about 40% reported more negative interactions and said things like, awkward, disappointed, empty, used, or confused. The people who generally reported more positive feelings also reported that overall they had less depression, less loneliness, and higher social connection. And the people who reported more negative said that in general they also felt they felt more depressed, more lonely, and had less social connection. And so I think one of the takeaway points is that if you're using hookups or casual sex to try to feel better, it's probably not going to help. But if you already feel good, it might be something that works for you. Interestingly, those who reported positive reactions also reported basically more intense casual hookups, sex hookups, and higher use of substances. But I don't think the takeaway point is that you should get drunk and go for it, but that was a correlation. Okay, so this is using data again from the American College Health Association survey from 2017 in terms of the experience of violence or abuse regarding romantic relationships. And so you can see the percentages there where people, and actually verbal threat I don't think was necessarily specific to romantic relationships, but just in general. So you can see that, quite a few people would be reporting kind of negative relationship experiences or scary relationship experiences.
So we hear a lot about increased anxiety and depression, but when you go and look at the research, how much that's really changing depends upon whether or not you're using diagnostic criteria or symptomatic criteria. So diagnostic criteria means that people either have a diagnosis, like, by a medical provider of anxiety or major depressive disorder, or on a screener, they meet the criteria to receive the diagnosis, even if they don't actually have it yet. For diagnostic studies, we do have less data on that around the world, and smaller and conflicting increases. So maybe we've gone from like 4.5% to 5% globally in the last 10-ish years. That might be higher in the US, up to 7%, but that's hard to figure out. When we look at diagnoses, there's higher rates of depression, for example, and anxiety diagnoses in countries that are experiencing conflict or war. Now, when we look at symptomatic data, this is when you might get asked at the doctor's office, have you felt depressed at all? Or how much have you felt depressed in the last few months? Or a single question like, how much have you felt nervous in the past months or year? For this, we have lots of data, and we can show much bigger increases in what people are reporting, kind of self-reported awareness of their own anxiety or depression. So this leads us to a really interesting discussion on, are we actually experiencing more anxiety and depression and mental health issues than we used to? Or are we just aware of it more? Are we talking about it more? So, for example, when I think of my own life, I've probably been anxious since I was a child, but I wouldn't have even called myself anxious until I was in my 40s, about 10 years ago, when kind of our societal use of that language and our awareness really increased. However, we could also say that perhaps it truly is increasing. So this data is from 2020, and we do have to use caution when interpreting it because there were some problems with data collection due to COVID. So they collected data between January and March, then not at all between March and September, and then again between October and December. So they had a much smaller sample size, and of course it was influenced by COVID. So this would be meeting the criteria for a major depressive episode during the year. And you can see that in 2020, we saw a high number, especially of emerging adults, meeting that criteria, a high percent, and then, even higher than normal for other other ages. And then in terms of race or ethnicity, we can see some of the highest for people who identified as 2 or more race or ethnicity categories. Females still not quite twice as much as males, but significantly higher. This was a symptomatic study, not a diagnostic study. So it was just based on a question: how have you experienced anxiety, how much during the past month? And these were people who answered most all of the time or all of the time. And so what you can see here is that beginning around 2013, we started to see a big rise in the self-reported anxiety symptoms for those ages 18 to 25, and then a little less so for those ages 26 to 34. Suicide rates are definitely a cause for concern among adolescents and emerging adults. However, it's important for us to keep in mind a couple of things. One, that on average, suicide rates are significantly higher for older adults, middle-aged and older adults, than they tend to be for adolescents and emerging adults. As you can see from these graphs, that's particularly the case for males. It's also important to know that suicide rates are dramatically higher for males as compared to females. So you can see the female graph tops out at around a rate of 10 per 100,000 within the age group, and the males graph kind of just is getting started at around that rate, and so goes much higher. However, noting these overall trends, we can also see for females that we are seeing an increase in the rates for 15 to 24-year-olds. That number has changed quite significantly since around 2011. So definitely something that we need to be paying attention to.
And so this is an example of asking college students just about symptoms that they've experienced. And so this isn't qualifying for an anxiety disorder or a depressive disorder, but this is just mental health related symptoms. And so we can see that lots of college students report kind of, difficult emotional or mental health related experiences, if we ask them about it over a 12-month period. And so one thing I'd ask you to consider is that research usually shows that men report less anxiety and depression than women. And so the question is, do women actually experience more, or do women just admit to it more, or is it harder to detect in men? Does it look different, and so they don't think that they've got anxiety and depression because it's coming across as irritability or frustration or anger or violence, right? So just something to consider. There's no clear answer on this, but worth thinking about. And you can see here that quite a few students have sought treatment for anxiety and depression in the last year, and more females than males. So college counseling centers are becoming increasingly overwhelmed and busy because we've had just a 6% enrollment increase overall at universities, but we've had now a 30% increase in who's seeking counseling services. And so counseling centers are really figuring out kind of how to respond to this, and sometimes there are long waiting lists. And so I also just want to remind people that here at CSU, in addition to the University Counseling Center, you also have the option for the Center for Family and Couple Therapy, which offers kind of low cost services for CSU students and their significant others.
So assuming that mental health issues are actually increasing for college students, and it's not just that we have only greater awareness of mental health issues that have always existed, here's the possible reasons, and we don't know for sure. So there's evidence for each of these. Sleep disruptions, which is also tied to social media and technology use. Sleep disruptions can also be tied to substance use too. Experiencing discrimination or stigma based on sexual orientation, gender identity, race, ethnicity, financial stress due to perhaps the rising cost of college, or you might consider something else. So I used to feel like there was maybe more clear evidence on the negative effects of social media use on mental health, but in more recent years, meta-analyses or reviews of many, meta-analyses and systematic reviews have really indicated inconsistent correlations or relationships between social media use and anxiety, depression, or social isolation. There are some studies that do find that higher use has higher risk of mental health issues and lower well-being, but there's more studies that really find weak or non-significant relationships. So you could imagine that it really could depend on how people are using it, and there could be a variety of effects from positive to negative to neutral to a mix.
One of the biggest issues potentially with technology is its influence on sleep disruption. And so one study found that about half of college students woke up after falling asleep because they heard their phone buzz, and so they kind of woke back up to answer text messages. And so the more students reported doing that, the lower their sleep quality and their increased rates of anxiety and depression. And there are, as we talked about in adolescence, a fairly set of robust research basically finding that poor sleep is really correlated with increased mental health issues and increased suicidality.
Let's see a little bit about pornography, which is common among emerging adults and college students, especially higher rates for males, but rates are increasing for females. Some are using it as a source of education. And this is just emerging. I don't think we know enough completely to say for sure, but there is limited research now linking heavy use to sexual dysfunction in males. And that could be things like dissatisfaction with real-world sex, experiencing a longer time to reach orgasm, or experiencing higher rates of erectile dysfunction.
Okay, so in this very last slide, I'm hoping you're thinking about, the decisions that you're making in your virtual life and how they're going to be influencing your trajectory later in life. And so what's going well in your virtual life and what are some areas of struggle?